The morning sun streamed through the massive windows of JFK International Airport's Terminal 5, casting long shadows across the polished floors. Flight 2317 to Los Angeles was preparing for boarding, and lead flight attendant Ms. Thompson stood at her usual spot, watching the early morning crowd with practiced eyes. She'd been with Sky Global Airlines for 15 years, and her crisp navy uniform and perfectly pinned hair reflected the high standards she'd maintained throughout her career. The first-class cabin was her domain, and today's flight was particularly special. The passenger list included several top executives heading to a major tech conference on the West Coast. Ms. Thompson had already memorized their names and faces from the priority passenger briefing, determined to provide the impeccable service that Sky Global's premium customers expected. The terminal buzzed with its usual morning energy. Business travelers typing away on laptops, families carolling sleepy children, and airport staff zooming past on their electric carts. Ms. Thompson observed it all while mentally reviewing the pre-flight checklist. Her attention was particularly focused on the first-class boarding area, where passengers were already gathering. "Good morning, Ms. Thompson," called out her colleague, Mr. Rivera, as he approached with the updated passenger manifest. "Looks like we're fully booked in first class today. Lot of big names on the list." She nodded, accepting the tablet from him. "Perfect. You know how particular corporate travelers can be about their morning routines. I've already asked the galley to stock extra of that premium roasted coffee they love." The morning light caught the silver streaks in her hair as she scrolled through the manifest. Years of experience had taught her exactly what to expect from first-class passengers, the subtle signs of privilege that came from a lifetime of luxury. She prided herself on being able to anticipate their needs before they even had to ask. As the gate agent made the first boarding announcement, Ms. Thompson straightened her already perfect posture and prepared her professional smile. A small crowd had formed near the priority boarding lane, mostly older men in expensive suits and women in designer business attire, exactly what she'd expected for today's flight. "I do love a smooth morning boarding," she mentioned to Mr. Rivera, who was organizing the welcome drinks cart. "When everyone knows their place, everything just flows better, doesn't it?" Little did she know that this ordinary Tuesday morning was about to become anything but smooth. As she stood there, confident in her assumptions about how the day would unfold, fate was preparing to teach her a lesson that would reshape not only her career, but her entire worldview. The boarding process began right on schedule at 7:30 a.m. Ms. Thompson watched as the first few premium passengers made their way down the jet bridge, mentally matching faces to the names she'd memorized. Everything was proceeding exactly as she'd expected, until it wasn't. The morning sun continued to brighten, unaware that it was about to witness a moment that would spark a national conversation about prejudice, privilege, and the power of humility. For now, though, Ms. Thompson simply stood at her post, clipboard in hand, unaware that her next interaction would change everything. Through the terminal windows, a private car pulled up to the curb outside. Its arrival went unnoticed by most, but this vehicle carried the catalyst that would turn this ordinary flight into an extraordinary lesson in humanity. Just as the morning boarding routine settled into its familiar rhythm, a young girl approached the first-class cabin entrance. She looked about 16, wearing a designer hoodie, perfectly fitted jeans, and limited edition sneakers that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. Despite her expensive attire, there was nothing showy about her presence. She carried herself with a quiet confidence that came from somewhere deeper than her wardrobe. Ms. Thompson's practiced smile flickered for just a moment. She'd been watching the first-class line carefully, and this teenager hadn't been among the suited executives she'd mentally cataloged. The girl pulled out her phone from her pocket, barely glancing up as she approached the cabin entrance, her carry-on rolling smoothly behind her. "Excuse me, sweetheart." Ms. Thompson stepped forward, her voice carrying that particular tone of polite authority she'd perfected over the years. "I believe economy class boarding will begin in about 20 minutes. You'll want to wait by gate 23B. The girl looked up from her phone, surprise flickering across her face. "Oh no, I'm in first class," she said, reaching for her boarding pass. "Seat 2A. Ms. Thompson's smile remained fixed, but her eyes narrowed slightly. There must be some mistake. "Let me see that boarding pass." She held out her hand, her perfectly manicured nails gleaming under the cabin lights. Other passengers had begun to notice the exchange. A few suited executives paused their phone conversations to watch. Mr. Rivera, arranging welcome champagne flutes nearby, slowed his movements, listening while pretending not to. The girl held out her boarding pass, her expression composed despite the growing awkwardness of the situation. "Everything's in order," she said quietly. "I fly this route pretty regularly." Ms. Thompson examined the boarding pass with exaggerated care. Indeed, it showed seat 2A, but something still felt off to her. In 15 years of service, she'd developed what she considered an instinct for first-class passengers. This teenager, despite her expensive clothes, didn't fit her mental image. "I'll need to verify this with the gate agent," Ms. Thompson declared, her voice carrying that special kind of authority that assumed agreement. "These premium seats are usually reserved for our executive travelers. Perhaps there's been a system error." The girl's composure cracked slightly, a flash of hurt crossing her features before she masked it. "There's no error," she said, her voice steady but softer now. "You can check the manifest. I'm listed there." A businessman in an expensive suit shifted uncomfortably in line behind her. He'd been watching the exchange with growing discomfort, his fingers drumming against his leather briefcase. A woman in a designer blazer nearby pretended to be absorbed in her phone, though her frown suggested she was listening to every word. "Nevertheless," Ms. Thompson persisted, "I think it would be best if you waited aside while we sort this out. We wouldn't want to hold up our other passengers." She gestured toward the waiting area, clearly expecting compliance. The girl stood her ground, though her hands trembled slightly as she reached for her phone. "I'll just make a quick call," she said, her voice remarkably controlled for someone being publicly humiliated. "This can be cleared up in a minute." Ms. Thompson's smile never wavered, though something in her chest tightened at the girl's quiet dignity. "Of course, dear, but please step aside while you do so. We need to keep the boarding process moving." As the girl stepped away from the line, phone in hand, the other passengers filed past. Some avoided looking at her, while others shot sympathetic glances her way. Mr. Rivera had disappeared into the galley, suddenly very busy with drink preparations. The morning sun still streamed through the cabin windows, casting long shadows across the scene. In the brightness of that light, something ugly was being exposed. Assumptions, prejudices, and the quiet violence of presumption. But in that same light, something powerful was about to emerge, something that would transform this moment of humiliation into a catalyst for change. The girl's fingers moved swiftly across her phone screen, composing a message rather than making a call. Her hands had stopped shaking now, and there was a certain stillness about her that suggested not defeat, but determination. In just a few moments, this quiet scene at the entrance of first class would become the beginning of a story that would echo far beyond Flight 2317. The young girl stepped away from the first-class entrance, her phone clutched in steady hands. The bustling airport terminal seemed to fade into background noise as she opened her contacts and scrolled to a familiar name. Her thumb hovered over it for just a moment. She'd faced situations like this before, but never on this airline, never on her father's airline. "Dad." Her voice was quiet but clear. "I need you to come to gate 23. There's a situation with the boarding." She listened for a moment, her expression carefully neutral. "No, I'm fine. Just, could you come? I'm at the first-class entrance." Meanwhile, Ms. Thompson had resumed her position at the cabin entrance, efficiently processing other passengers. She kept throwing glances at the girl, who now stood near the gate counter, phone pressed to her ear. Something about the teenager's composure made Ms. Thompson feel slightly uneasy, though she quickly pushed the feeling aside. Mr. Rivera approached his colleague, speaking in low tones. "Maybe we should double-check the manifest again," he suggested, his eyes darting between Ms. Thompson and the young passenger. "I know what I'm doing," Ms. Thompson replied firmly, though her fingers nervously adjusted her perfectly straight name tag. "In all my years of service, I've learned to spot when something isn't right." The girl ended her call and walked back toward the counter, where the gate agent was busy with paperwork. The agent looked up, meeting the teenager's eyes with a puzzled expression as she explained the situation. The color drained from the agent's face as she listened, her fingers flying across the keyboard to verify something on her screen. A businessman who had witnessed the earlier exchange was now on his own phone, speaking quietly but intensely. "You won't believe what I'm watching unfold at Gate 23, he murmured to someone. "This is going to be a PR nightmare for the airline." The terminal's usual sounds seemed to grow quieter, as if the space itself was holding its breath. A mother with 2 small children watched the scene unfold while pretending to organize her carry-on bag. Her older child tugged at her sleeve, asking in that loud whisper that children use, "Why isn't that girl allowed on the plane, Mom?" The girl stood calmly at the counter, her expensive sneakers rooted to the spot, her designer hoodie suddenly seeming less like a fashion statement and more like armor. She'd pulled her phone out again, this time sending a quick text, "I'm still at the gate. The flight attendant doesn't believe I belong in first class." The gate agent's phone rang, and she answered it with trembling hands. Her eyes widened as she listened, and she shot a panicked look at Ms. Thompson, who was still proudly guarding the first-class cabin entrance. A group of delayed passengers from another flight had gathered nearby, their own travel frustrations forgotten as they watched the scene unfold. One woman was openly filming with her phone, though she tried to be discreet about it. The air felt charged with anticipation, like the moment before a summer storm breaks. The morning sun continued to stream through the terminal windows, but now it felt less like gentle warmth and more like a spotlight, illuminating every gesture, every expression, every moment of this unfolding drama. Mr. Rivera had retreated to the aircraft, busying himself with final cabin preparations, but his movements were distracted. He'd seen something in the girl's quiet confidence that made him nervous about what was coming next. The girl checked her watch, a supple, expensive timepiece that Miss Thompson hadn't noticed earlier. Her expression remained composed, but there was a slight lift to her chin now, a quiet certainty in her posture that hadn't been there before. Through the large terminal windows, a black luxury car pulled up to the curb outside. The girl glanced at her phone one last time as a new message appeared, "Walking in now." The automatic doors at the terminal entrance slid open, and the morning sunlight silhouetted a tall figure stepping inside. Even from a distance, his purposeful stride and commanding presence drew attention. As he walked through the terminal, people instinctively moved out of his way, though most couldn't have explained why. The girl's phone buzzed one final time with a message that read, "I see you. Don't worry, sweetheart. This ends now." The terminal's usual buzz of activity seemed to fade as the tall figure approached Gate 23. He walked with a kind of confidence that came not from arrogance, but from absolute certainty of purpose. His tailored suit probably cost more than most people's monthly salary, but it was his presence rather than his clothing that commanded attention. The girl's face lit up with subtle relief as she spotted him. She didn't run to him or wave, she didn't need to. The man's eyes had already found her, and his expression shifted from concern to gentle reassurance before hardening as he took in the scene before him. Miss Thompson was still at her post, checking another passenger's boarding pass when she felt the atmosphere around her change. The businessman she was assisting suddenly straightened, his eyes widening in recognition. Other passengers who had been pretending not to watch the earlier drama now stood transfixed. "Good morning," the man's deep voice carried easily across the gate area. He didn't raise it, but somehow it cut through all other noise. "I understand there's been some confusion about my daughter's seating assignment." Miss Thompson turned, her professional smile freezing on her face. She knew that voice. She'd heard it many times in company-wide broadcasts and annual meetings. The man standing before her was the CEO and majority owner of the airline, her boss's boss's boss. The gate agent had already rushed forward, clutching her tablet. "Sir, I'm so sorry, we'd had no idea." He held up a hand, silencing her apology. "Please pull up the passenger manifest for today's flight." His tone was perfectly polite, but there was steel beneath the courtesy. Miss Thompson felt her knees weaken as realization crashed over her. The girl's expensive but casual clothes, her quiet confidence, her lack of surprise at being challenged, it all made terrible sense now. The teenager she tried to redirect to economy class was the airline owner's daughter. Nearby passengers were now openly staring, some recording with their phones, others whispering among themselves. The businessman who'd been on his phone earlier was now texting frantically, no doubt sharing the unfolding scene with his colleagues. Ms. Thompson, the CEO, read her name tag, his voice still measured and calm. "Would you mind explaining why my daughter was denied access to her assigned seat?" The first-class cabin entrance suddenly felt very small. Miss Thompson's mouth opened, but no words came out. Her 15 years of experience seemed to evaporate in the face of this moment. There must have been some misunderstanding, she finally managed. We have certain protocols for first-class verification. Protocols, he repeated the word thoughtfully. And these protocols include making assumptions based on what, exactly? The girl stepped forward then, placing a gentle hand on her father's arm. Dad, it's okay. This happens sometimes. No, he said firmly, though his voice remained quiet. It's not okay. And it shouldn't happen anywhere, least of all on our airline. Mr. Rivera had reappeared at the cabin door, looking like he wished he could disappear into the aircraft's upholstery. Other crew members hovered nearby, their faces a mixture of shock and dismay. The CEO looked around at the gathered crowd, then back at Ms. Thompson. I think we need to have a conversation about what first-class service really means. He turned to address the other passengers who had witnessed everything. I apologize for any delay this may cause to your journey. I assure you, this incident will lead to significant changes in our company's training procedures. Ms. Thompson's perfectly pressed uniform felt suffocating now. The morning sun that had seemed so pleasant earlier now felt like a spotlight, illuminating every flaw in her judgment, every unconscious bias she'd never acknowledged. The girl still stood quietly beside her father, but composure never wavering. There was no triumph in her expression, no satisfaction at her vindication. If anything, she looked tired. Tired in a way no 16-year-old should have to be. The CEO checked his watch. A subtle gesture that made Ms. Thompson flinch, remembering how she dismissed his daughter just minutes ago. I believe we have about 20 minutes before scheduled departure, he said. That should be enough time to begin addressing this situation properly. The gate area had fallen completely silent as the CEO gestured for everyone's attention. Even the usual airport announcements seemed muted, as if the terminal itself was listening. He stood there, his daughter by his side, addressing not just Ms. Thompson, but everyone within earshot. Let me tell you a story, he began, his voice quiet but carrying clearly through the hushed terminal. When I started this airline 20 years ago, I promised myself we'd be different. That every passenger who stepped onto our planes would be treated with equal respect and dignity. He paused, looking around at the gathered faces. Today, we failed that promise. Ms. Thompson's eyes were fixed on the floor, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. The CEO continued, his words measured and thoughtful. My daughter has experienced this kind of prejudice before. At restaurants, in stores, even at school. But never, never, did I expect it to happen on our own airline. He glanced at his daughter, who stood tall beside him, her quiet strength evident in her posture. A baby started crying somewhere in the crowd, and its mother quickly hushed it. The businessman who had been texting earlier had put his phone away, completely absorbed in the CEO's words. You see, he continued, first class isn't about expensive clothes or how someone looks. It's not about age or appearance or any other superficial measure. It's about a level of service we promise to deliver to every passenger who purchases a ticket. Every single one. The gate agent was furiously wiping tears from her eyes, trying to maintain her professional composure. Mr. Rivera had moved closer, standing just behind Miss Thompson like a silent supporter. I'm not angry, the CEO said, though his voice carried a weight of disappointment that was somehow worse than anger. I'm sad. Sad that in 2025, my daughter still has to face moments like this. Sad that an employee of our airline, our family, made assumptions based on nothing but appearances. He turned to address the other first-class passengers directly. How many of you spoke up? When you saw what was happening, how many of you said something? The silence that followed was deafening. Several passengers shifted uncomfortably, avoiding eye contact. A woman in an expensive suit clutched her handbag tighter, her face flushed with shame. That's part of the problem too, he said softly. Silence in the face of injustice is its own kind of compliance. The young girl finally spoke up, her voice clear and steady. Dad, we're going to delay the flight. He smiled at her, a mix of pride and sadness in his expression. Some things are more important than schedules, sweetheart. Some lessons need to be learned, even if they're uncomfortable. Turning back to Miss Thompson, his expression softened slightly. I know you've been with us for 15 years. I know you take pride in your work. But today, you need to ask yourself why you made the assumptions you did. What made you so certain my daughter didn't belong in first class?" Ms. Thompson looked up, tears streaming down her face. "Sir, I never meant." "I know you didn't," he interrupted gently. "That's exactly the point. These biases run so deep, we often don't even realize we have them. But they hurt people, real people, like my daughter, every single day." A younger flight attendant had begun distributing water to waiting passengers, her hands shaking slightly as she moved through the crowd. The morning sun had risen higher now, its warm light touching everyone equally, regardless of their ticket class or status. "Today's incident will lead to changes," the CEO announced, addressing the entire gate area. "Not just policy changes, but real, meaningful changes in how we train our staff and how we treat our passengers. Because this isn't just about one flight or one mistake. It's about being better, all of us together." His daughter reached for his hand then, a simple gesture that spoke volumes. Here was a father who had built an airline empire, yet his greatest concern was ensuring his child could move through the world with dignity. The lesson hung in the air, more powerful than any corporate training video, more impactful than any policy memo. It was a moment of truth that would ripple through the airline industry and beyond, touching lives far beyond Gate 23. The next few minutes unfolded like scenes from a movie no one had rehearsed for. Ms. Thompson was quietly escorted from the gate by airline management, her shoulders slumped, her perfect posture finally broken. As she walked away, she caught one last glimpse of the teenager she had wronged, now being warmly welcomed by the same first-class passengers who had stood silent minutes before. "Please, take my seat," offered a gray-haired executive, gesturing to 1A. "I'll be comfortable anywhere on the plane." His face flushed with embarrassment as he remembered his own silence during the confrontation. The young girl politely declined. "Thank you, but I'll keep my assigned seat." Her quiet dignity made several passengers look away, ashamed of their earlier inaction. The CEO had moved to the gate counter, speaking quietly with the staff. His presence transformed the typical pre-flight chaos into something more purposeful. Within minutes, new flight attendants arrived to replace Ms. Thompson's position, each one briefed on the situation and visibly determined to do better. "We'll be boarding shortly," announced the gate agent, her voice steadier now. "We appreciate everyone's patience during this learning moment." She paused, then added something that wasn't in any airline script. "And we're sorry. We'll do better." Inside the cabin, the atmosphere had shifted dramatically. The first-class section, usually a quiet space of privilege and separation, buzzed with subdued conversations. Passengers who normally buried themselves in laptops or phones were engaged in genuine dialogue about what they had witnessed. "I should have said something," murmured a woman in a designer suit to her seatmate. "I saw what was happening and just looked away." Her seatmate, a middle-aged businessman, nodded solemnly. "We all did. That's the problem, isn't it? We're so used to minding our own business that we forget when it's time to speak up." The flight attendants moved through the cabin with a new awareness, their usual service routines tinged with extra thoughtfulness. Mr. Rivera, who had remained on board, paid special attention to ensuring every passenger felt equally welcomed, regardless of their appearance or age. Social media was already buzzing with videos of the incident. One passenger's phone showed a viral tweet, "Watching an airline CEO teach a masterclass in leadership and human dignity at Gate 23. This is how real change happens." Outside the plane's windows, the morning sun continued its climb into the sky, but inside, something was shifting. Perspectives changing, assumptions being questioned, silent promises being made to do better, to be better. The CEO's daughter settled into her seat, pulling out a book from her bag. A flight attendant approached with a pre-flight drink, her smile genuine and warm. "Can I get you anything else?" she asked, making eye contact with the same respect she showed every passenger. "No, thank you," the girl replied with a small smile. She glanced around the cabin, noting how different it felt from when she first tried to board. The same passengers who had avoided eye contact earlier were now offering friendly nods and apologetic smiles. The CEO remained at the gate a bit longer, ensuring everything was properly handled. Before leaving, he spoke briefly with each staff member, not with anger or punishment, but with the clear expectation of change. His words carried the weight of someone who understood that true leadership means turning difficult moments into opportunities for growth. News of the incident was spreading through the terminal like ripples in a pond. At other gates, flight attendants were already having quiet conversations about their own practices. Passengers waiting for other flights shared the story with their neighbors, sparking discussions about times they had witnessed similar situations and remained silent. As the final boarding call was announced, the atmosphere in first class had transformed. The usual invisible barriers between passengers had melted away, replaced by a shared understanding of what they had witnessed and what it meant for all of them going forward. In the galley, the new lead flight attendant gathered her team for a brief huddle. "Today, we learned something valuable," she said quietly. "Let's make sure we remember it on every flight from now on." In the months that followed that memorable morning at Gate 23, the airline industry witnessed a transformation that nobody had expected. What started as a single incident became a catalyst for change that rippled far beyond one flight or one airline. The CEO wasted no time turning words into action. Within a week, he had assembled a special task force led by none other than his daughter. Despite being only 16, she brought a perspective that no corporate consultant could match, the lived experience of someone who had faced prejudice firsthand. "We're not here to punish," she told the board during her first presentation. "We're here to educate and grow." Her father watched from the back of the room, beaming with pride as she commanded the attention of executives twice her age. The changes began small but grew steadily. New training programs were developed, focusing not just on service protocols but on recognizing and addressing unconscious bias. Flight attendants participated in workshops led by diversity experts, but more importantly, by real people sharing real experiences. Ms. Thompson, the flight attendant from that fateful morning, underwent extensive sensitivity training. But something unexpected happened during this process. She found her voice. Instead of hiding from her mistake, she chose to own it, transforming her experience into a powerful teaching tool. "I thought I was doing my job," she would later tell a group of new airline employees, "but I was really just following assumptions I didn't even know I had." Her candid accounts of that morning became a cornerstone of the airline's new training program. The businessman who had filmed the incident that day shared the video, which went viral. But unlike many viral moments that fade quickly, this one sparked lasting conversations. Other airlines began reaching out, asking about the training programs. Industry magazines wrote articles about the changing face of luxury travel. 6 months after the incident, the CEO's daughter stood at another podium, this time addressing a conference of airline industry leaders. "Change doesn't happen in boardrooms," she told them. "It happens in moments, in choices, in the way we treat each other every single day." The airline's new policies became a model for the industry. First-class service was redefined not by appearances or assumptions, but by the simple principle of respect for every passenger. Customer satisfaction scores soared, not just in first class, but throughout the entire aircraft. Mr. Rivera, who had witnessed everything that morning, was promoted to lead the airline's new customer experience team. "We're not just serving passengers," became his motto. "We're serving people." A year later, the young girl who had faced discrimination that morning was featured in a national magazine's 30 Under 30 list for her work in transforming corporate culture. The article mentioned how she balanced her advocacy work with regular teenage life, still flying first class, still wearing her favorite hoodies, but now greeted with respect wherever she went. The airline launched a scholarship program offering opportunities in aviation to young people from diverse backgrounds. The program's name, Gate 23 Scholars, a reminder that positive change can start in the most unexpected places. Ms. Thompson found her own path to redemption. After completing her training, she became one of the airline's most requested speakers on corporate culture change. Her story of transformation resonated because it was real, human, and honest. The CEO made sure the changes weren't just cosmetic. Pay structures were revised to reward inclusive behavior. Hiring practices were overhauled. Even the airline's marketing changed, showcasing the true diversity of their passengers rather than stereotypical images of business travelers. 2 years after that morning at Gate 23, the airline won its first award for workplace culture. The trophy sits in the headquarters lobby next to a simple framed photo of a teenage girl in a hoodie, standing proud in first class. Below it, a quote reads, "Real change starts with seeing people for who they are, not who we assume them to be." The story became a case study in business schools, not just for crisis management, but for authentic leadership and cultural transformation. But perhaps the most meaningful change was the quietest, the daily moments of respect, dignity, and understanding that became the new normal, not just at one airline, but across an entire industry.